Chapter 9. I Take the Wings of a Dove. "Drive me somewhere to breakfast, Archie," I said, "for I'm perishing hungry." He and I got into the tonneau, and the driver swung us out of the station road, up a long incline of hill. Sir Archie had been one of my subalterns in the old Lennox Highlanders, and had left us before the Somme to join the Flying Corps. I heard that he had got his wings and had done well before Arras, and was now training pilots at home. He had been a light-hearted youth, who had endured a good deal of rough-tonguing from me for his sins of omission. But it was the casual class of lad I was looking for now. I saw him steal amused glances at my appearance. "Been seeing a bit of life, sir?" he inquired respectfully. "I'm being hunted by the police," I said. "Dirty dogs, but don't worry, sir, we'll get you off all right. I've been in the same fix myself. You can lie snug in my little log hut, for that old image Gibbons won't blab. Or, tell you what, I've got an aunt who lives near here, and she's a bit of a sportsman. You can hide in her moated grange till the bobbies get tired." I think it was Archie's calm acceptance of my position as natural and becoming that restored my good temper. He was far too well bred to ask what crime I had committed, and I didn't propose to enlighten him much. But as we swung up the moorland road, I let him know that I was serving the government, but that it was necessary that I should appear to be unauthenticated, and that therefore I must dodge the police. He whistled his appreciation. "Gad, that's a deep game. Sort of camouflage? Speaking from my experience, it is easy to overdo that kind of stunt. When I was at Misieux, the French started out to camouflage the caravans where they kept their pigeons, and they did it so damned well that the poor little birds couldn't hit 'em off, and spent the night out." We entered the white gates of a big aerodrome, skirted a forest of tents and huts, and drew up at a shanty on the far confines of the place. The hour was 4:30, and the world was still asleep. Archie nodded towards one of the hangars, from the mouth of which projected the propeller end of an aeroplane. "I'm by way of flying that bus down to Farnton tomorrow," he remarked. "It's the new Shark Gladys, got a mouth like a tree." An idea flashed into my mind. "You're going this morning," I said. "How did you know?" he exclaimed. "I'm due to go today, but the grouse up in Caithness wanted shooting so badly that I decided to wangle another day's leave. They can't expect a man to start for the south of England when he's just off a frowsy journey." "All the same, you're going to be a stout fellow and start in 2 hours' time, and you're going to take me with you." He stared blankly, then burst into a roar of laughter. "You're the man to go tiger shooting with. But what price my commandant? He's not a bad chap, but a trifle shaggy about the fetlocks. He won't appreciate the joke." "He needn't know. He mustn't know. This is an affair between you and me till it's finished. I promise you I'll make it all square with the Flying Corps. Get me down to Farnton before evening, and you'll have done a good piece of work for your country." "Right-o, let's have a tub and a bit of breakfast, and then I'm your man. I'll tell them to get the bus ready." In Archie's bedroom I washed and shaved, and borrowed a green tweed cap and a brand new aquascutum. The latter covered the deficiencies of my raiment, and when I commandeered a pair of gloves I felt almost respectable. Gibbons, who seemed to be a jack of all trades, cooked us some bacon and an omelette, and as he ate Archie yarned. In the battalion his conversation had been mostly of race meetings and the forsaken delights of town, but now he had forgotten all that, and like every good airman I have ever known, wallowed enthusiastically in shop. I have a deep respect for the Flying Corps, but it is apt to change its jargon every month, and its conversation is hard for the layman to follow. He was desperately keen about the war, which he saw wholly from the viewpoint of the air. Arras to him was over before the infantry crossed the top, and the tough bit of the Somme was October, not September. He calculated that the big air fighting had not come along yet, and all he hoped for was to be allowed out to France to have his share in it. Like all good airmen, he was very modest about himself. "I've done a bit of steeplechasing and hunting, and I've good hands for a horse, so I can handle a bus fairly well. It's all a matter of hands, you know. There ain't half the risk of the infantry down below you, and 1,000,000 times the fun. Jolly glad I changed, sir." We talked of Peter, and he put him about top. Voss, he thought, was the only Boche that could compare with him, for he hadn't made up his mind about Lensch. The Frenchman Guinemet he ranked high, but in a different way. I remember he had no respect for Richthofen and his celebrated circus. At 6 sharp we were ready to go. A couple of mechanics had got out the machine, and Archie put on his coat and gloves and climbed into the pilot's seat, while I squeezed in behind in the observer's place. The aerodrome was waking up, but I saw no officers about. We were scarcely seated when Gibbons called our attention to a motor car on the road, and presently we heard a shout and saw men waving in our direction. "Better get off, my lad," I said. "These look like my friends." The engine started and the mechanic stood clear. As we taxied over the turf, I looked back and saw several figures running in our direction. The next second we had left the bumpy earth for the smooth highroad of the air. I had flown several dozen times before, generally over the enemy lines when I wanted to see for myself how the land lay. Then we had flown low and had been nicely dusted by the Hun Archies, not to speak of an occasional machine gun. But never till that hour had I realized the joy of a straight flight in a swift plane in perfect weather. Archie didn't lose time. Soon the hangars behind looked like a child's toys, and the world ran away from us till it seemed like a great golden bowl spilling over with the quintessence of light. The air was cold and my hands numbed, but I never felt them. As we throbbed and tore southward, sometimes bumping in eddies, sometimes swimming evenly in a stream of motionless ether, my head and heart grew as light as a boy's. I forgot all about the vexations of my job and saw only its joyful comedy. I didn't think that anything on earth could worry me again. Far to the left was a wedge of silver, and behind it a cluster of toy houses. That must be Edinburgh, where reposed my portmanteau, and where a most efficient police force was now inquiring for me. At the thought I laughed so loud that Archie must have heard me. He turned round, saw my grinning face, and grinned back. Then he signalled to me to strap myself in. I obeyed, and he proceeded to practice stunts, the loop, the spinning nosedive, and others I didn't even know the names of. It was glorious fun, and he handled his machine as a good rider coaxes a nervous horse over a stiff hurdle. He had that extra something in his blood that makes the great pilot. Presently the chessboard of green and brown had changed to a deep purple with faint silvery lines like veins in a rock. We were crossing the Border Hills, the place where I had legged it for weary days when I was mixed up in the Black Stone business. What a marvellous element was this air, which took one far above the fatigues of humanity. Archie had done well to change. Peter had been the wise man. I felt a tremendous pity for my old friend hobbling about a German prison yard when he had once flown a hawk. I reflected that I had wasted my life hitherto. And then I remembered that all this glory had only one use in war, and that was to help the muddy British infantryman to down his Hun opponent. He was the fellow, after all, that decided battles, and the thought comforted me. A great exhilaration is often the precursor of disaster, and mine was to have a sudden downfall. It was getting on for noon, and we were well into England. I guessed from the rivers we had passed that we were somewhere in the north of Yorkshire, when the machine began to make odd sounds, and we bumped in perfectly calm patches of air. We dived and then climbed, but the confounded thing kept sputtering. Archie passed back a slip of paper on which he had scribbled, "Engine conked. Must land at Micklegill. Very sorry." So we dropped to a lower elevation where we could see clearly the houses and roads and the long swelling ridges of a moorland country. I could never have found my way about, but Archie's practised eye knew every landmark. We were trundling along very slowly now, and even I was soon able to pick up the hangars of a big aerodrome. We made Micklegill, but only by the skin of our teeth. We were so low that the smoky chimneys of the city of Bradfield, 7 miles to the east, were half hidden by a ridge of down. Archie achieved a clever descent in the lee of a belt of firs, and got out full of imprecations against the Gladys engine. "I'll go up to the camp and report," he said, "and send mechanics down to tinker this darned gramophone. You'd better go for a walk, sir. I don't want to answer questions about you till we're ready to start. I reckon it'll be about an hour's job." The cheerfulness I had acquired in the upper air still filled me. I sat down in a ditch as merry as a sandboy and lit a pipe. I was possessed by a boyish spirit of casual adventure, and waited on the next turn of fortune's wheel with only a pleasant amusement. That turn was not long in coming. Archie appeared very breathless. "Look here, sir, there's the deuce of a row up there. They've been wiring about you all over the country, and they know you're with me. They've got the police, and they'll have you in 5 minutes if you don't leg it. I lied like Billy-O and said I had never heard of you, but they're coming to see for themselves. For God's sake, get off. You'd better keep in cover down that hollow and round the back of these trees. I'll stay here and try to brazen it out. I'll get strafed to blazes anyhow. I hope you'll get me out of the scrape, sir." "Don't you worry, my lad," I said. "I'll make it all square when I get back to town. I'll make for Bradfield, for this place is a bit conspicuous. Goodbye, Archie. You're a good chap, and I'll see you don't suffer." I started off down the hollow of the moor, trying to make speed atone for lack of strategy, for it was hard to know how much my pursuers commanded from that higher ground. They must have seen me, for I heard whistles blown and men's cries. I struck a road, crossed it, and passed a ridge from which I had a view of Bradfield 6 miles off. And as I ran I began to reflect that this kind of chase could not last long. They were bound to round me up in the next half hour unless I could puzzle them. But in that bare, green place there was no cover, and it looked as if my chances were pretty much those of a hare coursed by a good greyhound on a naked moor. Suddenly, from just in front of me, came a familiar sound. It was the roar of guns, the slam of field batteries, and the boom of small howitzers. I wondered if I had gone off my head. As I plodded on, the rattle of machine guns was added, and over the ridge before me I saw the dust and fumes of bursting shells. I concluded that I was not mad, and that therefore the Germans must have landed. I crawled up the last slope, quite forgetting the pursuit behind me. And then I'm blessed if I did not look down on a veritable battle. There were 2 sets of trenches, with barbed wire and all the fixings, one set filled with troops and the other empty. On these latter shells were bursting, but there was no sign of life in them. In the other lines there seemed the better part of 2 brigades, and the first trench was stiff with bayonets. My first thought was that home forces had gone dotty, for this kind of show could have no sort of training value. And then I saw other things, cameras and cameramen on platforms on the flanks, and men with megaphones behind them on wooden scaffoldings. One of the megaphones was going full blast all the time. I saw the meaning of the performance at last. Some movie merchant had got a graft with the government, and troops had been turned out to make a war film. It occurred to me that if I were mixed up in that push, I might get the cover I was looking for. I scurried down the hill to the nearest cameraman. As I ran, the first wave of troops went over the top. They did it uncommon well, for they entered into the spirit of the thing, and went over with grim faces in that slow, purposeful lope that I had seen in my own fellows at Arras. Smoke grenades burst among them, and now and then some resourceful mountebank would roll over. Altogether it was about the best show I have ever seen. The cameras clicked, the guns banged, a background of Boy Scouts applauded, and the dust rose in billows to the sky. But all the same, something was wrong. I could imagine that this kind of business took a good deal of planning from the point of view of the movie merchant, for his purpose was not the same as that of the officer in command. You know how a photographer finicks about and is dissatisfied with a pose that seems all right to his sitter. I should have thought the spectacle enough to get any cinema audience off their feet, but the man on the scaffolding near me judged differently. He made his megaphone boom like the swan song of a dying buffalo. He wanted to change something and didn't know how to do it. He hopped on one leg, he took the megaphone from his mouth to curse, he waved it like a banner and yelled at some opposite number on the other flank. And then his patience forsook him, and he skipped down the ladder, dropping his megaphone past the cameramen onto the battlefield. That was his undoing. He got in the way of the second wave and was swallowed up like a leaf in a torrent. For a moment I saw a red face and a loud checked suit, and the rest was silence. He was carried on over the hill or rolled into an enemy trench, but anyhow he was lost to my ken. I bagged his megaphone and hopped up the steps to the platform. At last I saw a chance of first-class cover, for with Archie's coat and cap I made a very good appearance as a movie merchant. 2 waves had gone over the top, and the cinema men, working like beavers, had filmed a lot. But there was still a fair amount of troops to play with, and I determined to tangle up that outfit so that the fellows who were after me would have better things to think about. My advantage was that I knew how to command men. I could see that my opposite number with the megaphone was helpless, for the mistake which had swept my man into a shell hole had reduced him to impotence. The troops seemed to be mainly in charge of NCOs. I could imagine that the officers would try to shirk this business, and an NCO is the most literal creature on earth. So, with my megaphone, I proceeded to change the battle order. I brought up the 3rd wave to the front trenches. In about 3 minutes the men had recognized the professional touch and were moving smartly to my orders. They thought it was part of the show, and the obedient cameras clicked at everything that came into their orbit. My aim was to deploy the troops on too narrow a front, so that they were bound to fan outward, and I had to be quick about it, for I didn't know when the hapless movie merchant might be retrieved from the battlefield and dispute my authority. It takes a long time to straighten a thing out, but it does not take long to tangle it, especially when the thing is so delicate a machine as disciplined troops. In about 8 minutes I had produced chaos. The flanks spread out, in spite of all the shepherding of the NCOs, and the fringe engulfed the photographers. The cameras on their little platforms went down like 9-pins. It was solemn to see the startled face of a photographer, taken unawares, supplicating the purposeful infantry before he was swept off his feet into speechlessness. It was no place for me to linger in, so I chucked away the megaphone and got mixed up with the tail of the 3rd wave. I was swept on and came to anchor in the enemy trenches, where I found, as I expected, my profane and breathless predecessor, the movie merchant. I had nothing to say to him, so I stuck to the trench till it ended against the slope of the hill. On that flank, delirious with excitement, stood a knot of Boy Scouts. My business was to get to Bradfield as quickly as my legs would take me, and as inconspicuously as the gods would permit. Unhappily, I was far too great an object of interest to that nursery of heroes. Every Boy Scout is an amateur detective and hungry for knowledge. I was followed by several who plied me with questions and were told that I was off to Bradfield to hurry up part of the cinema outfit. It sounded lame enough, for that cinema outfit was already past praying for. We reached the road, and against a stone wall stood several bicycles. I selected one and prepared to mount. "That's Mr. Emmett's machine," said one boy sharply. "He told me to keep an eye on it." "I must borrow it, sonny," I said. "Mr. Emmett's my very good friend and won't object." From the place where we stood I overlooked the back of the battlefield and could see an anxious congress of officers. I could see others, too, whose appearance I did not like. They had not been there when I operated on the megaphone. They must have come downhill from the aerodrome, and in all likelihood were the pursuers I had avoided. The exhilaration which I had won in the air, and which had carried me into the tomfoolery of the past half-hour, was ebbing. I had the hunted feeling once more, and grew middle-aged and cautious. I had a baddish record for the day, what with getting Archie into a scrape and busting up an official cinema show, neither consistent with the duties of a brigadier-general. Besides, I had still to get to London. I had not gone 200 yards down the road when a Boy Scout, pedalling furiously, came up abreast me. "Colonel Edgeworth wants to see you," he panted. "You're to come back at once." "Tell him I can't wait now," I said. "I'll pay my respects to him in an hour." "He said you were to come at once," said the faithful messenger. "He's in an awful temper with you, and he's got bobbies with him." I put on pace and left the boy behind. I reckoned I had the better part of 2 miles' start, and could beat anything except petrol. But my enemies were bound to have cars, so I had better get off the road as soon as possible. I coasted down a long hill to a bridge which spanned a small discoloured stream that flowed in a wooded glen. There was nobody for the moment on the hill behind me, so I slipped into the covert, shoved the bicycle under the bridge, and hid Archie's aquascutum in a bramble thicket. I was now in my own disreputable tweeds, and I hoped that the shedding of my most conspicuous garment would puzzle my pursuers if they should catch up with me. But this I was determined they should not do. I made good going down that stream and out into a lane which led from the downs to the market gardens round the city. I thanked heaven I had got rid of the aquascutum, for the August afternoon was warm and my pace was not leisurely. When I was in secluded ground I ran, and when anyone was in sight I walked smartly. As I went I reflected that Bradfield would see the end of my adventures. The police knew that I was there, and would watch the stations and hunt me down if I lingered in the place. I knew no one out there, and had no chance of getting an effective disguise. Indeed, I very soon began to wonder if I should get even as far as the streets. For at the moment when I had got a lift on the back of a fishmonger's cart, and was screened by its flapping canvas, two figures passed by on motor bicycles, and one of them was the inquisitive Boy Scout. The main road from the aerodrome was probably now being patrolled by motor cars. It looked as if there would be a degrading arrest in one of the suburbs. The fish cart, helped by half a crown to the driver, took me past the outlying small villadom, between long lines of workmen's houses, to narrow cobbled lanes and the purlieus of great factories. As soon as I saw the streets well crowded, I got out and walked. In my old clothes I must have appeared like some second-class bookie or seedy horse-coper. The only respectable thing I had about me was my gold watch. I looked at the time and found it 5:30. I wanted food and was casting about for an eating-house when I heard the purr of a motorcycle and across the road saw the intelligent Boy Scout. He saw me, too, and put on the brake with a sharpness which caused him to skid and all but come to grief under the wheels of a wool wagon. That gave me time to efface myself by darting up a side street. I had an unpleasant sense that I was about to be trapped, for in a place I knew nothing of I had not a chance to use my wits. I remember trying feverishly to think, and I suppose that my preoccupation made me careless. I was now in a veritable slum, and when I put my hand to my vest pocket I found that my watch had gone. That put the top stone on my depression. The reaction from the wild burnout of the forenoon had left me very cold about the feet. I was getting into the underworld again, and there was no chance of a second Archie Roylance turning up to rescue me. I remember yet the sour smell of the factories and the mist of smoke in the evening air. It is a smell I have never met since without a sort of dulling of spirit. Presently I came out into a marketplace. Whistles were blowing, and there was a great hurrying of people back from the mills. The crowd gave me a momentary sense of security, and I was just about to inquire my way to the railway station when someone jostled my arm. A rough-looking fellow in mechanic's clothes was beside me. "Mate," he whispered, "I got summat of yours here." And to my amazement he slipped my watch into my hand. "It was took by mistake. We're friends of yours. You're right enough if you do what I tell you. There's a peeler over there got his eye on you. Follow me and I'll get you off." I didn't much like the man's looks, but I had no choice, and anyhow he had given me back my watch. He sidled into an alley between tall houses, and I sidled after him. Then he took to his heels and led me a twisting course through smelly courts into a tan-yard, and then by a narrow lane to the back quarters of a factory. Twice we doubled back, and once we climbed a wall and followed the bank of a blue-black stream with a filthy scum on it. Then we got into a very mean quarter of the town, and emerged in a dingy garden strewn with tin cans and broken flower-pots. By a back door we entered one of the cottages, and my guide very carefully locked it behind him. He lit the gas and drew the blinds in a small parlour, and looked at me long and quizzically. He spoke now in an educated voice. "I ask no questions," he said, "but it's my business to put my services at your disposal. You carry the passport." I stared at him, and he pulled out his watch and showed a white and purple cross inside the lid. "I don't defend all the people we employ," he said, grinning. "Men's morals are not always as good as their patriotism. One of them pinched your watch, and when he saw what was inside it, he reported to me. We soon picked up your trail and observed you were in a bit of trouble. As I say, I ask no questions. What can we do for you?" I want to get to London without any questions asked. They're looking for me in my present rig, so I've got to change it." "That's easy enough," he said. "Make yourself comfortable for a little and I'll fix you up. The night train goes at 11:30. You'll find cigars in the cupboard, and there's this week's Critic on the table. It's got a good article on Conrad, if you care for such things." I helped myself to a cigar and spent a profitable half-hour reading about the vices of the British government. Then my host returned and bade me ascend to his bedroom. "You're Private Henry Tompkins of the 12th Gloucesters, and you'll find your clothes ready for you. I'll send on your present togs if you give me an address." I did as I was bid, and presently emerged in the uniform of a British private, complete down to the shapeless boots and the dropsical puttees. Then my friend took me in hand and finished the transformation. He started on my hair with scissors and arranged a lock which, when well oiled, curled over my forehead. My hands were hard and rough and only needed some grubbiness and hacking about the nails to pass muster. With my cap on the side of my head, a pack on my back, a service rifle in my hands, and my pockets bursting with penny picture papers, I was the very model of the British soldier returning from leave. I had also a packet of Woodbine cigarettes and a hunch of bread and cheese for the journey. And I had a railway warrant made out in my name for London. Then my friend gave me supper, bread and cold meat and a bottle of Bass which I wolfed savagely, for I had had nothing since breakfast. He was a curious fellow, as discreet as a tombstone, very ready to speak about general subjects, but never once coming near the intimate business which had linked him and me, and heaven knows how many others, by means of a little purple and white cross in a watch-case. I remember we talked about the topics that used to be popular at Biggleswick, the big political things that begin with capital letters. He took Amos's view of the soundness of the British working man, but he said something which made me think. He was convinced that there was a tremendous lot of German spy work about, and that most of the practitioners were innocent. The ordinary Briton doesn't run to treason, but he's not very bright. A clever man in that kind of game can make better use of a fool than a rogue. As he saw me off, he gave me a piece of advice. "Get out of these clothes as soon as you reach London. Private Tompkins will frank you out of Bradfield, but it mightn't be a healthy alias in the metropolis." At 11:30 I was safe in the train, talking the jargon of the returning soldier, with half a dozen of my own type in a smoky third-class carriage. I had been lucky in my escape, for at the station entrance and on the platform I had noticed several men with the unmistakable look of plainclothes police. Also, though this may have been my fancy, I thought I caught in the crowd a glimpse of the bagman who had called himself Linkletter. Chapter 10. The Advantages of an Air Raid. The train was abominably late. It was due at 8:27, but it was nearly 10 when we reached St. Pancras. I had resolved to go straight to my rooms in Westminster, buying on the way a cap and waterproof to conceal my uniform should anyone be near my door on my arrival. Then I would ring up Blenkiron and tell him all my adventures. I breakfasted at a coffee stall, left my pack and rifle in the cloakroom, and walked out into the clear sunny morning. I was feeling very pleased with myself. Looking back on my madcap journey, I seemed to have had an amazing run of luck, and to be entitled to a little credit too. I told myself that persistence always pays, and that nobody is beaten till he is dead. All Blenkiron's instructions had been faithfully carried out. I had found Ivory's post office, I had laid the lines of our own special communications with the enemy, and so far as I could see, I had left no clue behind me. Ivory and Gresson took me for a well-meaning nincompoop. It was true that I had aroused profound suspicion in the breast of the Scottish police. But that mattered nothing, for Cornelius Brand, the suspect, would presently disappear, and there was nothing against the rising soldier, Brigadier-General Richard Hannay, who would soon be on his way to France. After all, this piece of service had not been so very unpleasant. I laughed when I remembered my grim forebodings in Gloucestershire. Bullivant had said it would be damnably risky in the long run, but here was the end, and I had never been in danger of anything worse than making a fool of myself. I remember that as I made my way through Bloomsbury, I was not thinking so much of my triumphant report to Blenkiron as of my speedy return to the front. Soon I would be with my beloved brigade again. I had missed Messines and the first part of 3rd Ypres, but the battle was still going on, and I had yet a chance. I might get a division, for there had been talk of that before I left. I knew the army commander thought a lot of me. But on the whole I hoped I would be left with the brigade. After all, I was an amateur soldier, and I wasn't certain of my powers with a bigger command. In Charing Cross Road I thought of Mary, and the brigade seemed suddenly less attractive. I hoped the war wouldn't last much longer, though with Russia heading straight for the devil, I didn't know how it was going to stop very soon. I was determined to see Mary before I left, and I had a good excuse, for I had taken my orders from her. The prospect entranced me, and I was mooning along in a happy dream when I collided violently with an agitated citizen. Then I realized something very odd was happening. There was a dull sound like the popping of the corks of flat soda-water bottles. There was a humming, too, from very far up in the skies. People in the street were either staring at the heavens or running wildly for shelter. A motor bus in front of me emptied its contents in a twinkling. A taxi pulled up with a jar, and the driver and the fare dived into a second-hand bookshop. It took me a moment or two to realize the meaning of it all, and I had scarcely done this when I got a very practical proof. 100 yards away a bomb fell on a street island, shivering every window pane in a wide radius, and sending splinters of stone flying about my head. I did what I had done 100 times before at the front, and dropped flat on my face. The man who says he doesn't mind being bombed or shelled is either a liar or a maniac. This London air raid seemed to me a singularly unpleasant business. I think it was the sight of the decent civilized life around one and the orderly streets, for what was perfectly natural in a rubble heap like Ypres, Arras, seemed like an outrage here. I remember once being in billets in a Flanders village where I had the mayor's house, and sat in a room upholstered in cut velvet with wax flowers on the mantelpiece and oil paintings of 3 generations on the walls. The Boche took it into his head to shell the place with a long-range naval gun, and I simply loathed it. It was horrible to have dust and splinters blown into that snug, homely room, whereas if I had been in a ruined barn I wouldn't have given the thing 2 thoughts. In the same way, bombs dropping in central London seemed a grotesque indecency. I hated to see plump citizens with wild eyes, and nursemaids with scared children, and miserable women scuttling like rabbits in a warren. The drone grew louder, and looking up, I could see the enemy planes flying in a beautiful formation, very leisurely as it seemed, with all London at their mercy. Another bomb fell to the right, and presently bits of our own shrapnel were clattering viciously around me. I thought it about time to take cover, and ran shamelessly for the best place I could see, which was a tube station. 5 minutes before, the streets had been crowded. Now I left behind me a desert dotted with 1 bus and 3 empty taxicabs. I found the tube entrance filled with excited humanity. 1 stout lady had fainted, and a nurse had become hysterical, but on the whole people were behaving well. Oddly enough, they did not seem inclined to go down the stairs to the complete security of underground, but preferred rather to collect where they could still get a glimpse of the upper world, as if they were torn between fear of their lives and interest in the spectacle. That crowd gave me a good deal of respect for my countrymen, but several were badly rattled, and 1 man a little way off, whose back was turned, kept twitching his shoulders as if he had the colic. I watched him curiously, and a movement of the crowd brought his face into profile. Then I gasped with amazement, for I saw that it was Ivory. And yet it was not Ivory. There were the familiar nondescript features, the blandness, the plumpness, but all, so to speak, in ruins. The man was in a blind funk. His features seemed to be dislimning before my eyes. He was growing sharper, finer, in a way younger, a man without grip on himself, a shapeless creature in process of transformation. He was being reduced to his rudiments. Under the spell of panic, he was becoming a new man. And the crazy thing was that I knew the new man better than the old. My hands were jammed close to my sides by the crowd. I could scarcely turn my head, and it was not the occasion for one's neighbours to observe one's expression. If it had been, mine must have been a study. My mind was far away from air raids, back in the hot summer weather of 1914. I saw a row of villas perched on a headland above the sea. In the garden of one of them 2 men were playing tennis, while I was crouching behind an adjacent bush. One of these was a plump young man who wore a coloured scarf round his waist and babbled of golf handicaps. I saw him again at the villa dining room wearing a dinner jacket and lisping a little. I sat opposite him at bridge. I beheld him collared by 2 of Macgillivray's men when his comrade had rushed for the 39 steps that led to the sea. I saw, too, the sitting-room of my old flat in Portland Place, and heard little Scudder's quick, anxious voice talking about the 3 men he feared most on earth, one of whom lisped in his speech. I had thought that all 3 had long ago been laid under the turf. He was not looking my way, and I could devour his face in safety. There was no shadow of doubt. I had always put him down as the most amazing actor on earth, for had he not played the part of the First Sea Lord and deluded that officer's daily colleagues? But he could do far more than any human actor, for he could take on a new personality and with it a new appearance, and live steadily in the character as if he had been born in it. My mind was a blank, and I could only make blind gropings at conclusions. How had he escaped the death of a spy and murderer, for I had last seen him in the hands of justice? Of course he had known me from the first day in Biggleswick. I had thought to play with him, and he had played most cunningly and damnably with me. In that sweating sardine tin of refugees I shivered in the bitterness of my chagrin. And then I found his face turned to mine, and I knew that he recognized me. More, I knew that he knew that I had recognized him, not as Ivory, but as that other man. There came into his eyes a curious look of comprehension, which for a moment overcame his funk. I had sense enough to see that that put the final lid on it. There was still something doing if he believed that I was blind, but if he once thought that I knew the truth, he would be through our meshes and disappear like a fog. My first thought was to get at him and collar him and summon everybody to help me by denouncing him for what he was. Then I saw that that was impossible. I was a private soldier in a borrowed uniform, and he could easily turn the story against me. I must use surer weapons. I must get to Bullivant and Macgillivray and set their big machine to work. Above all, I must get to Blenkiron. I started to squeeze out of that push, for air raids now seemed far too trivial to give a thought to. Moreover, the guns had stopped, but so sheep-like is human nature that the crowd still hung together, and it took me a good 15 minutes to edge my way to the open air. I found that the trouble was over, and the street had resumed its usual appearance. Buses and taxis were running, and voluble knots of people were recounting their experiences. I started off for Blenkiron's bookshop as the nearest harbour of refuge. But in Piccadilly Circus I was stopped by a military policeman. He asked my name and battalion, and I gave him them, while his suspicious eye ran over my figure. I had no pack or rifle, and the crush in the tube station had not improved my appearance. I explained that I was going back to France that evening, and he asked for my warrant. I fancy my preoccupation made me nervous, and I lied badly. I said I had left it with my kit in the house of my married sister, but I fumbled in giving the address. I could see that the fellow did not believe a word of it. Just then up came an APM. He was a pompous dugout, very splendid in his red tabs, and probably bucked up at having just been under fire. Anyhow, he was out to walk in the strict path of duty. "Tompkins," he said. "Tompkins, we've got some fellow of that name on our records. Bring him along, Wilson." "But, sir," I said, I simply must meet my friend. It's urgent business, and I assure you I'm all right. If you don't believe me, I'll take a taxi and we'll go down to Scotland Yard, and I'll stand by what they say." His brow grew dark with wrath. "What infernal nonsense is this? Scotland Yard? What the devil has Scotland Yard to do with it? You're an impostor. I can see it in your face. I'll have your depot rung up and you'll be in jail in a couple of hours. I know a deserter when I see him. Bring him along, Wilson. You know what to do if he tries to bolt." I had a momentary thought of breaking away, but decided that the odds were too much against me. Fuming with impatience, I followed the APM to his office on the first floor in a side street. The precious minutes were slipping past. Ivery, now thoroughly warned, was making good his escape, and I, the sole repository of a deadly secret, was tramping in this absurd procession. The APM issued his orders. He gave instructions that my depot should be rung up, and he bade Wilson remove me to what he called the guard room. He sat down at his desk and busied himself with a mass of buff dockets. In desperation I renewed my appeal. "I implore you to telephone to Mr. Macgillivray at Scotland Yard. It's a matter of life and death, sir. You're taking a very big responsibility if you don't." I had hopelessly offended his brittle dignity. "Any more of your insolence and I'll have you put in irons. I'll attend to you soon enough for your comfort. Get out of this till I send for you." As I looked at his foolish, irritable face, I realized that I was fairly up against it. Short of assault and battery on everybody, I was bound to submit. I saluted respectfully and was marched away. The hours I spent in that bare ante-room are like a nightmare in my recollection. A sergeant was busy at a desk with more buff dockets, and an orderly waited on a stool by a telephone. I looked at my watch and observed that it was 1 o'clock. Soon the slamming of a door announced that the APM had gone to lunch. I tried conversation with the fat sergeant, but he very soon shut me up. So I hunched up on the wooden form and chewed the cud of my vexation. I thought with bitterness of the satisfaction which had filled me in the morning. I had fancied myself the devil of a fine fellow, and I had been no more than a mountebank. The adventures of the past days seemed merely childish. I had been telling lies and cutting capers over half Britain, thinking I was playing a deep game, and I had only been behaving like a schoolboy. On such occasions a man is rarely just to himself, and the intensity of my self-abasement would have satisfied my worst enemy. It didn't console me that the futility of it all was not my blame. I was looking for excuses. It was the facts that cried out against me, and on the facts I had been an idiotic failure. For of course Ivery had played with me since the first day at Biggleswick. He had applauded my speeches and flattered me and advised me to go to the Clyde, laughing at me all the time. Gresson, too, had known. Now I saw it all. He had tried to drown me between Colonsay and Mull. It was Gresson who had set the police on me in Morven. The bagman Linkletter had been one of Gresson's creatures. The only meagre consolation was that the gang had thought me dangerous enough to attempt to murder me, and that they knew nothing about my doings in Skye. Of that I was positive. They had marked me down, but for several days I had slipped clean out of their ken. As I went over all the incidents, I asked if everything was yet lost. I had failed to hoodwink Ivery, but I had found out his post office, and if he only believed I hadn't recognized him for the miscreant of the Black Stone, he would go on in his old ways and play into Blenkiron's hands. Yes, but I had seen him in undress, so to speak, and he knew that I had so seen him. The only thing now was to collar him before he left the country, for there was ample evidence to hang him on. The law must stretch out its long arm and collect him and Gresson and the Portuguese Jew, try them by court-martial, and put them decently underground. But he had now had more than an hour's warning, and I was entangled with red tape in this damned APM's office. The thought drove me frantic, and I got up and paced the floor. I saw the orderly, with rather a scared face, making ready to press the bell, and I noticed that the fat sergeant had gone to lunch. "Say, mate," I said, "don't you feel inclined to do a poor fellow a good turn? I know I'm for it all right, and I'll take my medicine like a lamb, but I want badly to put a telephone call through." "It ain't allowed," was the answer. "I get L from the old man." "But he's gone out," I urged. "I don't want you to do anything wrong, mate. I leave you to do the talking if you'll only send my message. I'm flush of money, and I don't mind handing you a quid for the job." He was a pinched little man with a weak chin, and he obviously wavered. "Who'd you want to talk to?" he asked. "Scotland Yard," I said, "the home of the police. Lord bless you, there can't be no harm in that. You've only got to ring up Scotland Yard, I'll give you the number, and give the message to Mr. Macgillivray. He's the head bummer of all the bobbies." "That sounds a bit of all right," he said. "The old man, he won't be back for 'alf an hour, nor the sergeant neither. Let's see your quid, though." I laid a £1 note on the form beside me. "It's yours, mate, if you get through to Scotland Yard and speak the piece I'm going to give you." He went over to the instrument. "What do you want to say to the bloke with the long name?" "Say that Richard Hannay is detained at the APM's office in Claxton Street. Say he's got important news. Say urgent and secret news, and ask Mr. Macgillivray to do something about it at once." "But Hannay ain't the name you gave." "Lord bless you, no. Did you never hear of a man borrowing another name? Anyhow, that's the one I want you to give." "But if this Mac man comes round here, they'll know he's been rung up, and I'll have the old man down on me." It took 10 minutes and a second £1 note to get him past this hurdle. By and by he screwed up courage and rang up the number. I listened with some nervousness while he gave my message. He had to repeat it twice, and waited eagerly on the next words. "No, sir," I heard him say. "He don't want you to come round 'ere. He thinks as how, I mean to say, he wants—" I took a long stride and twitched the receiver from him. "Macgillivray," I said, "is that you? Richard Hannay. For the love of God, come round here this instant and deliver me from the clutches of a tomfool APM. I've got the most deadly news, and there's not a second to waste. For God's sake, come quick." Then I added, "Just tell your fellows to gather Ivory in at once. You know his lairs." I hung up the receiver and faced a pale and indignant orderly. "It's all right," I said. "I promise you that you won't get into any trouble on my account, and there's your £2." The door in the next room opened and shut. The APM had returned from lunch. 10 minutes later the door opened again. I heard Macgillivray's voice, and it was not pitched in dulcet tones. He had run up against minor officialdom and was making hay with it. I was my own master once more, so I forsook the company of the orderly. I found a most rattled officer trying to save a few rags of his dignity, and the formidable figure of Macgillivray instructing him in manners. "Glad to see you, Dick," he said. "This is General Hannay, sir. It may comfort you to know that your folly may have made just the difference between your country's victory and defeat. I shall have a word to say to your superiors." It was hardly fair. I had to put in a word for the old fellow, whose red tab seemed suddenly to have grown dingy. "It was my blame wearing this kit. We'll call it a misunderstanding and forget it. But I would suggest that civility is not wasted even on a poor devil of a defaulting private soldier." Once in Macgillivray's car, I poured out my tale. "Tell me it's a nightmare," I cried. "Tell me that the 3 men we collected on the Rough were shot long ago." "2, he replied, "but 1 escaped. Heaven knows how he managed it, but he disappeared clean out of the world." "The plump one who lisped in his speech?" Macgillivray nodded. "Well, we're in for it this time. Have you issued instructions?" "Yes. With luck we shall have our hands on him within an hour. We've our net round all his haunts." "But 2 hours' start. It's a big handicap for your dealing with a genius." "Yet I think we can manage it. Where are you bound for?" I told him my rooms in Westminster, and then to my old flat in Park Lane. "The day of disguises is past. In half an hour I'll be Richard Hannay. It'll be a comfort to get into uniform again. Then I'll try look up Blenkiron." He grinned. "I gather you've had a riotous time. We've had a good many anxious messages from the north about a certain Mr. Brand. I couldn't discourage our men, for I fancied it might have spoiled your game. I heard that last night they had lost touch with you in Bradfield, so I rather expected to see you here today. Efficient body of men, the Scottish police." "Especially when they have various enthusiastic amateur helpers." "So?" he said. "Yes, of course. They would have. But I hope presently to congratulate you on the success of your mission." "I'll bet you a pony you don't," I said. "I never bet on a professional subject. Why this pessimism?" "Only that I know our gentleman better than you. I've been twice up against him. He's the kind of wicked that don't cease from troubling till they're stone dead. And even then I'd want to see the body cremated and take the ashes into mid-ocean and scatter them. I've got a feeling that he's the biggest thing you or I will ever tackle." Chapter 11. The Valley of Humiliation. I collected some baggage and a pile of newly arrived letters from my rooms in Westminster, and took a taxi to my Park Lane flat. Usually I had gone back to that old place with a great feeling of comfort, like a boy from school who ranges about his room at home and examines his treasures. I used to like to see my hunting trophies on the wall and to sink into my own armchairs. But now I had no pleasure in the thing. I had a bath and changed into uniform, and that made me feel in better fighting trim. But I suffered from a heavy conviction of abject failure, and had no share in Macgillivray's optimism. The awe with which the Black Stone gang had filled me 3 years before had revived 1,000-fold. Personal humiliation was the least part of my trouble. What worried me was the sense of being up against something inhumanly formidable and wise and strong. I believe I was willing to own defeat and chuck up the game. Among the unopened letters was one from Peter, a very bulky one which I sat down to read at leisure. It was a curious epistle, far the longest he had ever written me, and its size made me understand his loneliness. He was still at his German prison camp, but expecting every day to go to Switzerland. He said he could get back to England or South Africa if he wanted, for they were clear that he could never be a combatant again, but he thought he had better stay in Switzerland, for he would be unhappy in England with all his friends fighting. As usual, he made no complaints, and seemed to be very grateful for his small mercies. There was a doctor who was kind to him, and some good fellows among the prisoners. But Peter's letter was made up chiefly of reflection. He had always been a bit of a philosopher, and now, in his isolation, he had taken to thinking hard and poured out the results to me on pages of thin paper in his clumsy handwriting. I could read between the lines that he was having a stiff fight with himself. He was trying to keep his courage going in face of the bitterest trial he could be called on to face, a crippled old age. He had always known a good deal about the Bible, and that and the Pilgrim's Progress were his chief aids in reflection. Both he took quite literally, as if they were newspaper reports of actual recent events. He mentioned that after much consideration he had reached the conclusion that the 3 greatest men he had ever heard of or met were Mr. Valiant for Truth, the Apostle Paul, and a certain Billy Strang who had been with him in Mashonaland in '92. Billy I knew all about. He had been Peter's hero and a leader till a lion got him to Blauberg. Peter preferred Valiant for Truth to Mr. Greatheart, I think, because of his superior truculence. For being very gentle himself, he loved a bold speaker. After that he dropped into a vein of self-examination. He regretted he fell far short of any of the 3. He thought that he might with luck resemble Mr. Standfast, for like him he had not much trouble in keeping wakeful, and was also as poor as a howler, and didn't care for women. He only hoped that he could imitate him in making a good end. Then followed some remarks of Peter's on courage, which came to me in that London room as if spoken by his living voice. I have never known anyone so brave by instinct, or anyone who hated so much to be told so. It was almost the only thing that could make him angry. All his life he had been facing death, and to take risks seemed to him as natural as to get up in the morning and eat his breakfast. But he had started out to consider the very thing which before he had taken for granted, and here is an extract from his conclusions. I paraphrase him, for he was not grammatical. It's easy enough to be brave if you're feeling well and have food inside you, and it's not so difficult even if you're short of a meal and seedy, for that makes you inclined to gamble. I mean by being brave, playing the game by the right rules without letting it worry you that you may very likely get knocked on the head. It's the wisest way to save your skin. It doesn't do to think about death if you're facing a charging lion or trying to bluff a lot of savages. If you think about it, you'll get it. If you don't, the odds are you won't. That kind of courage is only good nerves and experience. Most courage is experience. Most people are a little scared at new things. You want a bigger heart to face danger which you go out to look for, and which doesn't come to you in the ordinary way of business. Still, that's pretty much the same thing, good nerves and good health, and a natural liking for rows. You see, Dick, in all that game there's a lot of fun. There's excitement and the fun of using your wits and skill, and you know the bad bits can't last long. When our Col sent me to Buchan's kraal, I didn't altogether fancy the job, but at the worst it was 3 parts sport, and I got so excited that I never thought of the risk till it was over. But the big courage is the cold-blooded kind, the kind that never lets go even when you're feeling empty inside, and your blood's thin, and there's no kind of fun or profit to be had, and the trouble's not over in an hour or two, but lasts for months and years. One of the men here was speaking about that kind, and he called it fortitude. I reckon fortitude's the biggest thing a man can have, just to go on enduring when there's no guts or heart left in you. Billy had it when he trekked solitary from Garangos to the Limpopo with fever and a broken arm, just to show the Portugooses that he wouldn't be down by them. But the head man at the job was the Apostle Paul. Peter was writing for his own comfort, for fortitude was all that was left to him now. But his words came pretty straight to me, and I read them again and again, for I needed the lesson. Here was I losing heart just because I had failed in the first round, and my pride had taken a knock. I felt honestly ashamed of myself, and that made me a far happier man. There could be no question of dropping the business, whatever its difficulties. I had a queer religious feeling that Ivery and I had our fortunes intertwined, and that no will of mine could keep us apart. I had faced him before the war and won. I had faced him again and lost. The 3rd time or the 20th time we would reach a final decision. The whole business had hitherto appeared to me a trifle unreal, at any rate my own connection with it. I had been docilely obeying orders, but my real self had been standing aside and watching my doings with a certain aloofness. But that hour in the tube station had brought me into the serum, and I saw the affair not as Bullivant's or even Blenkiron's, but as my own. Before, I had been itching to get back to the front. Now I wanted to get onto Ivory's trail, though it should take me through the nether pit. Peter was right. Fortitude was the thing a man must possess if he would save his soul. The hours passed, and as I expected, there came no word from Macgillivray. I had some dinner sent up to me at 7 o'clock. At about 8 I was thinking of looking up Blenkiron. Just then came a telephone call asking me to go round to Sir Walter Bullivant's house in Queen Anne's Gate. 10 minutes later I was ringing the bell, and the door was opened to me by the same impassive butler who had admitted me on that famous night 3 years before. Nothing had changed in the pleasant green-panelled hall. The alcove was the same as when I had watched from it the departure of the man who now called himself Ivory. The telephone book lay in the very place from which I had snatched it in order to ring up the First Sea Lord. And in the back room, where that night 5 anxious officials had conferred, I found Sir Walter and Blenkiron. Both looked worried, the American feverishly so. He walked up and down the hearthrug, sucking an unlit black cigar. "Say, Dick," he said, "this is a bad business. It wasn't no fault of yours. You did fine. It was us, me and Sir Walter and Mr. Macgillivray, that were the quitters." "Any news?" I asked. "So far the cover's drawn blank," Sir Walter replied. "It was the devil's own work that our friend looked your way today. You're pretty certain he saw that you recognized him?" "Absolutely. As sure as that he knew I recognized him in your hall 3 years ago, when he was swaggering as Lord Alloa." "No," said Blenkiron dolefully. "That little flicker of recognition is just the one thing you can't be wrong about. Land alive, I wish Mr. Macgillivray would come." The bell rang and the door opened, but it was not Macgillivray. It was a young girl in a white ball gown and a cluster of blue cornflowers at her breast. The sight of her fetched Sir Walter out of his chair so suddenly that he upset his coffee cup. "Mary, my dear, how did you manage it? I didn't expect you till the late train." "I was in London, you see, and they telephoned me on your telegram. I'm staying with Aunt Doria, and I cut her theatre party. She thinks I'm at the Shandwicks dance, so I needn't go home till morning. Good evening, General Hannay. You got over the hill difficulty." "The next stage is the Valley of Humiliation," I answered. "So it would appear," she said gravely, and sat very quietly on the edge of Sir Walter's chair with her small, cool hand upon his. I had been picturing her in my recollection as very young and glimmering, a dancing, exquisite child. But now I revised that picture. The crystal freshness of morning was still there, but I saw how deep the waters were. It was the clean fineness and strength of her that entranced me. I didn't even think of her as pretty, any more than a man thinks of the good looks of the friend he worships. We waited, hardly speaking a word, till Macgillivray came. The first sight of his face told his story. "Gone?" asked Blenkiron sharply. The man's lethargic calm seemed to have wholly deserted him. "Gone," repeated the newcomer. "We have just tracked him down. Oh, he managed it cleverly. Never a sign of disturbance in any of his lairs. His dinner ordered at Biggleswick, and several people invited to stay with him for the weekend, one a member of the government. 2 meetings at which he was to speak arranged for next week. Early this afternoon he flew over to France as a passenger in one of the new planes. He had been mixed up with the Air Board people for months, of course, as another man with another face. Miss Lamington discovered that just too late. The bus went out of its course and came down in Normandy. By this time our man's in Paris or beyond it." Sir Walter took off his big tortoiseshell spectacles and laid them carefully on the table. "Roll up the map of Europe," he said. "This is our Austerlitz. Mary, my dear, I am feeling very old." Macgillivray had the sharpened face of a bitterly disappointed man. Blenkiron had got very red, and I could see that he was blaspheming violently under his breath. Mary's eyes were quiet and solemn. She kept on patting Sir Walter's hand. The sense of some great impending disaster hung heavily on me, and to break the spell I asked for details. "Tell me just the extent of the damage," I asked. "Our neat plan for deceiving the Boche has failed. That is bad. A dangerous spy has got beyond our power. That's worse. Tell me, is there still a worst? What's the limit of mischief he can do?" Sir Walter had risen and joined Blenkiron on the hearthrug. His brows were furrowed and his mouth hard, as if he was suffering pain. "There is no limit," he said. "None that I can see, except the long suffering of God. You know the man as Ivery, and you knew him as that other whom you believed to have been shot one summer morning and decently buried. You feared the second, at least if you didn't, I did, most mortally. You realized that we feared Ivery, and you knew enough about him to see his fiendish cleverness. Well, you have the two men combined in one man. Ivery was the best brain Macgillivray and I ever encountered, the most cunning and patient and long-sighted. Combine him with the other, the chameleon who can blend himself with his environment and has as many personalities as there are types and traits on the earth. What kind of enemy is that to have to fight?" "I admit it's a steep proposition. But after all, how much ill can he do? There are pretty strict limits to the activity of even the cleverest spy." "I agree. But this man is not a spy who buys a few wretched subordinates and steals a dozen private letters. He's a genius who has been living as part of our English life. There's nothing he hasn't seen. He's been on terms of intimacy with all kinds of politicians. We know that. He did it as Ivery. They rather liked him, for he was clever and flattered them, and they told him things. But God knows what he saw and heard in his other personalities. For all I know, he may have breakfasted at Downing Street with letters of introduction from President Wilson, or visited the Grand Fleet as a distinguished neutral. Then think of the women, how they talk. We're the leakiest society on earth, and we safeguard ourselves by keeping dangerous people out of it. We trust to our outer barrage. But anyone who has really slipped inside has a million chances. And this, remember, is one man in 10 millions, a man whose brain never sleeps for a moment, who is quick to seize the slightest hint, who can piece a plan together out of a dozen bits of gossip. It's as if the chief of the intelligence department was suddenly to desert to the enemy. The ordinary spy knows only bits of unconnected facts. This man knows our life and our way of thinking and everything about us." "Well, but a treatise on English life in time of war won't do much good to the Boche." Sir Walter shook his head. "Don't you realize the explosive stuff that is lying about? Ivery knows enough to make the next German peace offensive really deadly. Not the blundering thing which it has been up to now, but something which gets our weak spots on the raw. He knows enough to wreck our campaign in the field. And the awful thing is that we don't know just what he knows or what he is aiming for. This war's a packet of surprises. Both sides are struggling for the margin, the little fraction of advantage, and between evenly matched enemies it's just the extra atom of foreknowledge that tells." "Then we've got to push off and get after him," I said cheerfully. "But what are you going to do?" asked Macgillivray. "If it were merely a question of destroying an organization it might be managed, for an organization presents a big front. But it's a question of destroying this one man, and his front is a razor edge. How are you going to find him? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and such a needle which can become a piece of straw or a tin tack when it chooses." "All the same, we've got to do it," I said, remembering old Peter's lesson on fortitude, though I can't say I was feeling very stout-hearted. Sir Walter flung himself wearily into an armchair. "I wish I could be an optimist," he said, "but it looks as if we must own defeat. I've been at this work for 20 years, and though I've been often beaten, I've always held certain cards in the game. Now I'm hanged if I have any. It looks like a knockout, Hannay. It's no good deluding ourselves. We're men enough to look facts in the face and tell ourselves the truth. I don't see any ray of light in the business. We've missed our shot by a hair's breadth, and that's the same as missing by miles." I remember he looked at Mary as if for confirmation, but she did not smile or nod. Her face was very grave, and her eyes looked steadily at him. Then they moved and met mine, and they seemed to give me my marching orders. "Sir Walter," I said, 3 years ago you and I sat in this very room. We thought we were done to the world, as we think now. We had just that one miserable little clue to hang on to, a dozen words scribbled in a notebook by a dead man. You thought I was mad when I asked for Scudder's book, but we put our backs into the job, and in 24 hours we had won out. Remember that we were fighting against time. Now we have a reasonable amount of leisure. Then we had nothing but a piece of gibberish. Now we have a great body of knowledge, for Blenkiron has been brooding over ivory like an old hen, and he knows his ways of working and his breed of confederate. You've got something to work on now. Do you mean to tell me that when the stakes are so big you're going to chuck in your hand?" Macgillivray raised his head. "We know a good deal about Ivory, but Ivory's dead. We know nothing of the man who was so gloriously resurrected this evening in Normandy." "Oh yes, we do. There are many faces to the man, but only one mind, and you know plenty about that mind." "I wonder," said Sir Walter, "how can you know a mind which has no characteristics except that it is wholly and supremely competent? Mere mental powers won't give us a clue. We want to know the character which is behind all the personalities. Above all, we want to know its foibles. If we had only a hint of some weakness, we might make a plan." "Well, let's set down all we know," I cried, for the more I argued the keener I grew. I told them in some detail the story of the night in the Coolin, and what I had heard there. "There's the 2 names, Chelius and Bommaerts. The man spoke them in the same breath as Elfenbein, so they must be associated with Ivory's gang. You've got to get the whole Secret Service of the Allies busy to fit a meaning to these 2 words. Surely to goodness you'll find something. Remember, those names don't belong to the ivory part, but to the big game behind all the different disguises. Then there's the talk about the wild birds and the cage birds. I haven't a guess at what it means, but it refers to some infernal gang, and among your piles of records there must be some clue. You set the intelligence of 2 hemispheres busy on the job. You've got all the machinery, and it's my experience that if even one solitary man keeps chewing on at a problem, he discovers something." My enthusiasm was beginning to strike sparks from Macgillivray. He was looking thoughtful now instead of despondent. "There might be something in that," he said, "but it's a far-out chance." "Of course it's a far-out chance, and that's all we're ever going to get from Ivory. But we've taken a bad chance before and won. Then you've all that you know about Ivory here. Go through his dossier with a small-toothed comb, and I'll bet you find something to work on. Blenkiron, you're a man with a cool head. You admit we have a sporting chance." "Sure, Dick. He's fixed things so that the lines are across the track, but we'll clear somehow. So far as John S. Blenkiron is concerned, he's got just one thing to do in this world, and that's to follow the yellow dog and have him neatly and cleanly tied up. I've got a stack of personal affronts to settle. I was easy fruit, and he hasn't been very respectful. You can count me in, Dick." "Then we're agreed," I cried. "Well, gentlemen, it's up to you to arrange the first stage. You've some pretty solid staff work to put in before you get on the trail." "And you?" Sir Walter asked. "I'm going back to my brigade. I want a rest and a change. Besides, the first stage is office work, and I'm no use for that. But I'll be waiting to be summoned, and I'll come like a shot as soon as you hoik me out. I've got a presentiment about this thing. I know there'll be a finish, and that I'll be in at it, and I think it will be a desperate, bloody business too." I found Mary's eyes fixed upon me, and in them I read the same thought. She had not spoken a word, but had sat on the edge of a chair, swinging a foot idly, one hand playing with an ivory fan. She had given me my old orders, and I looked to her for confirmation of the new. "Miss Lamington, you are the wisest of the lot of us. What do you say?" She smiled, that shy, companionable smile which I had been picturing to myself through all the wanderings of the past month. "I think you're right. We've got a long way to go yet, for the Valley of Humiliation comes only halfway in the Pilgrim's Progress. The next stage was Vanity Fair. I might be of some use there, don't you think?" I remember the way she laughed and flung back her head like a gallant boy. "The mistake we've all been making," she said, "is that our methods are too terre-à-terre. We've a poet to deal with, a great poet, and we must fling our imaginations forward to catch up with him. His strength is his unexpectedness, you know, and we won't beat him by plodding only. I believe the wildest course is the wisest, for it's the most likely to intersect his. Who's the poet among us?" "Peter," I said, "but he's pinned down with a game leg in Germany. All the same, we must rope him in." By this time we had all cheered up, for it is wonderful what a tonic there is in a prospect of action. The butler brought in tea, which it was Bullivant's habit to drink after dinner. To me it seemed fantastic to watch a slip of a girl pouring it out for two grizzled and distinguished servants of the state and one battered soldier. As decorous a family party as you would ask to see, and to reflect that all four were engaged in an enterprise where men's lives must be reckoned at less than thistledown. After that we went upstairs to a noble Georgian drawing-room, and Mary played to us. I don't care two straws for music from an instrument, unless it be the pipes or a regimental band, but I dearly love the human voice. But she would not sing, for singing to her, I fancy, was something that did not come at will, but flowed only like a bird's note when the mood favoured. I did not want it either. I was content to let Cherry Ripe be the one song linked with her in my memory. It was Macgillivray who brought us back to business. "I wish to heaven there was one habit of mind we could definitely attach to him, and to no one else." At this moment "he" had only one meaning for us. "You can't do nothing with his mind," Blenkiron drawled. "You can't loose the bands of Orion, as the Bible says, or hold Leviathan with a hook. I reckoned I could, and made a mighty close study of his devices. But the darned cuss wouldn't stay put. I thought I had him tied down to the double bluff, and he went and played the triple bluff on me. There's nothing doing that line." A memory of Peter recurred to me. "What about the blind spot?" I asked, and I told them old Peter's pet theory. Every man that God made has his weak spot somewhere, some flaw in his character which leaves a dull patch in his brain. We've got to find that out, and I think I've made a beginning. Macgillivray, in a sharp voice, asked me my meaning. "He's in a funk or something. Oh, I don't mean he's a coward. A man in his trade wants the nerve of a buffalo. He could give us all points and courage. What I mean is that he's not clean white all through. There are yellow streaks somewhere in him. I've given a good deal of thought to this courage business, for I haven't got a great deal of it myself. Not like Peter, I mean. I've got heaps of soft places in me. I'm afraid of being drowned, for one thing, or of getting my eyes shot out. Ivory's afraid of bombs. At any rate, he's afraid of bombs in a big city. I once read a book which talked about a thing called agoraphobia. Perhaps it's that. Now, if we know that weak spot, it helps us in our work. There are some places he won't go to, and there are some things he can't do. Not well, anyway. I reckon that's useful." "Yes," said Macgillivray. "Perhaps it's not what you'd call a burning and shining light." "There's another chink in his armour," I went on. "There's one person in the world he can never practise his transformations on, and that's me. I shall always know him again, though he appeared as Sir Douglas Haig. I can't explain why, but I've got a feel in my bones about it. I didn't recognise him before, for I thought he was dead, and the nerve in my brain which should have been looking for him wasn't working. But I'm on my guard now, and that nerve's functioning at full power. Whenever and wherever and howsoever we meet again on the face of the earth, it will be Dr. Livingstone, I presume, between him and me." "That is better," said Macgillivray. "If we have any luck, Hannay, it won't be long till we pull you out of His Majesty's forces." Mary got up from the piano and resumed her old perch on the arm of Sir Walter's chair. "There's another blind spot which you haven't mentioned." It was a cool evening, but I noticed that her cheeks had suddenly flushed. "Last week Mr. Ivery asked me to marry him," she said. Chapter 12. I become a combatant once more. I returned to France on 13 September and took over my old brigade on the 19th of the same month. We were shoved in at the Polygon Wood on the 26th, and after 4 days got so badly mauled that we were brought out to refit. On 7 October, very much to my surprise, I was given command of a division and was on the fringes of the Ypres fighting during the first days of November. From that front we were hurried down to Cambrai in support, but came in only for the last backwash of that singular battle. We held a bit of the Saint-Quentin sector till just before Christmas, when we had a spell of rest in billets, which endured, so far as I was concerned, till the beginning of January, when I was sent off on the errand which I shall presently relate. That is a brief summary of my military record in the latter part of 1917. I am not going to enlarge on the fighting. Except for the days of the Polygon Wood, it was neither very severe nor very distinguished, and you will find it in the history books. What I have to tell of here is my own personal quest, for all the time I was living with my mind turned two ways. In the morasses of the Hannay flats, in the slimy support lines at Zonnebeek, in the tortured uplands around Flequières, and in many other odd places, I kept worrying at my private conundrum. At night I would lie awake thinking of it, and many a toss I took into shell holes, and many a time I stepped off the duckboards, because my eyes were on a different landscape. Nobody ever chewed a few wretched clues into such pulp as I did during those bleak months in Flanders and Picardy. For I had an instinct that the thing was desperately grave, graver even than the battle before me. Russia had gone headlong to the devil, Italy had taken it between the eyes and was still dizzy, and our own prospects were none too bright. The Boche was getting uppish, and with some cause, and I foresaw a rocky time ahead till America could line up with us in the field. It was the chance for the wild birds, and I used to wake in a sweat to think what devilry Ivery might be engineering. I believe I did my proper job reasonably well, but I put in my most savage thinking over the other. I remember how I used to go over every hour of every day, from that June night in the Cotswolds till my last meeting with Bullivant in London, trying to find a new bearing. I should probably have got brain fever if I hadn't had to spend most of my days and nights fighting a stiffish battle with a very watchful Hun. That kept my mind balanced, and I dare say it gave an edge to it, for during those months I was lucky enough to hit on a better scent than Bullivant and Macgillivray and Blenkiron pulling 1,000 wires in their London offices. I will set down in order of time the various incidents in this private quest of mine. The first was my meeting with Geordie Hamilton. It happened just after I rejoined the brigade, when I went down to have a look at our Scots Fusilier battalion. The old brigade had been roughly handled on the 31st July and had had to get heavy drafts to come anywhere near strength. The Fusiliers especially were an almost new lot, formed by joining our remnants to the remnants of a battalion in another division and bringing about a dozen officers from the training unit at home. I inspected the men and my eyes caught sight of a familiar face. I asked his name and the colonel got it from the sergeant major. It was Lance Corporal George Hamilton. Now, I wanted a new batman, and I resolved then and there to have my old antagonist. That afternoon he reported to me at brigade headquarters. As I looked at that solid, bandy-legged figure, standing as stiff to attention as a tobacconist's sign, his ugly face hewn out of brown oak, his honest, sullen mouth, and his blue eyes staring into vacancy, I knew I had got the man I wanted. "Hamilton," I said, "you and I have met before." "Sir?" came the mystified answer. "Look at me, man, and tell me if you don't recognize me." He moved his eyes a fraction in a respectful glance. "Sir, I don't mind of you." "Well, I'll refresh your memory. Do you remember the hall in New Mill Street and the meeting there? You had a fight with a man outside and got knocked down." He made no answer, but his colour deepened. "And a fortnight later in a public house in Muirtown you saw the same man and gave him the chase of his life." I could see his mouth set, for visions of the penalties laid down by the King's regulations for striking an officer must have crossed his mind, but he never budged. "Look me in the face, man," I said. "Do you remember me now?" He did as he was bid. "Sir, I mind of you." "Have you nothing more to say?" He cleared his throat. "Sir, I did not ken I was hittin' an officer." "Of course you didn't. You did perfectly right, and if the war was over and we were both free men, I would give you a chance of knocking me down here and now. That's got to wait. When you saw me last I was serving my country, though you didn't know it. We're serving together now, and you must get your revenge out of the Boche. I'm going to make you my servant, for you and I have a pretty close bond between us. What do you say to that?" This time he looked me full in the face. His troubled eye appraised me and was satisfied. "I'm proud to be servant to ye, sir," he said. Then out of his chest came a strangled chuckle, and he forgot his discipline. "Losh, but you're the great lad." He recovered himself promptly, saluted, and marched off. The second episode befell during our brief rest after the Polygon Wood, when I had ridden down the line one afternoon to see a friend in the heavy artillery. I was returning in the drizzle of evening, clanking along the greasy path between the sad poplars, when I struck a Labour company repairing the ravages of a Boche strafe that morning. I wasn't very certain of my road and asked one of the workers. He straightened himself and saluted, and I saw beneath a disreputable cap the features of the man who had been with me in the Coolin crevice. I spoke a word to his sergeant, who fell him out, and he walked a bit of the way with me. "Great Scott, Wake, what brought you here?" I asked. "Same thing as brought you, this rotten war." I had dismounted and was walking beside him, and I noticed that his lean face had lost its pallor, and that his eyes were less hot than they used to be. "You seem to thrive on it," I said, for I did not know what to say. A sudden shyness possessed me. Wake must have gone through some violent cyclones of feeling before it came to this. He saw what I was thinking and laughed in his sharp, ironical way. "Don't flatter yourself you've made a convert. I think as I always thought. But I came to the conclusion that since the fates had made me a government servant, I might as well do my work somewhat less cushioned than a chair in the Home Office. Oh no, it wasn't a matter of principle. One kind of work's as good as another, and I'm a better clerk than a navvy. With me it was self-indulgence. I wanted fresh air and exercise." I looked at him, mud to the waist, and his hands all blistered and cut with unaccustomed labour. I could realise what his associates must mean to him, and how he would relish the rough tonguing of non-coms. "You're a confounded humbug," I said. "Why on earth didn't you go into an OTC and come out with a commission? They're easy enough to get." "You mistake my case," he said bitterly. "I experienced no sudden conviction about the justice of the war. I stand where I always stood. I'm a non-combatant, and I wanted a change of civilian work. No, it wasn't any idiotic tribunal sent me here. I came of my own free will, and I'm really rather enjoying myself." "It's a rough job for a man like you," I said. "Not so rough as the fellows get in the trenches. I watched a battalion marching back today, and they looked like ghosts who had been years in muddy graves, white faces and dazed eyes and leaden feet. Mine's a cushy job. I like it best when the weather's foul. It cheats me into thinking I'm doing my duty." I nodded towards a recent shell hole. "Much of that sort of thing?" "Now and then. We had a good dusting this morning. I can't say I like it at the time, but I like to look back on it. A sort of moral anodyne." I wonder what on earth the rest of your lot make of you." "They don't make anything. I'm not remarkable for my bonhomie. They think I'm a prig, which I am. It doesn't amuse me to talk about beer and women, or listen to a gramophone, or grouse about my last meal. But I'm quite content, thank you. Sometimes I get a seat in a corner of a YMCA hut, and I've a book or two. My chief affliction is the padre. He was up at Keble in my time, and, as one of my colleagues puts it, wants to be too bloody helpful. What are you doing, Hannay? I see you're some kind of general. They're pretty thick on the ground here." "I'm a sort of general. Soldiering in the salient isn't the softest of jobs, but I don't believe it's as tough as yours is for you. Do you know, Wake, I wish I had you in my brigade. Trained or untrained, you're a dashed stout-hearted fellow." He laughed, with a trifle less acidity than usual. "Almost thou persuadest me to be combatant. No, thank you, I haven't the courage, and besides there's my jolly old principles. All the same, I'd like to be near you. You're a good chap, and I've had the honour to assist in your education. I must be getting back, or the sergeant will think I've bolted." We shook hands, and the last I saw of him was a figure saluting stiffly in the wet twilight. The third incident was trivial enough, though momentous in its results. Just before I got the division I had a bout of malaria. We were in support in the salient in very uncomfortable trenches behind Velchy, and I spent 3 days on my back in a dugout. Outside was a blizzard of rain, and the water now and then came down the stairs through the gas curtain and stood in pools at my bed foot. It wasn't the merriest place to convalesce in, but I was hard as nails at the time, and by the third day I was beginning to sit up and be bored. I read all my English papers twice, and a big stack of German ones, which I used to have sent up by a friend in the GHQ intelligence, who knew I liked to follow what the Boche was saying. As I dozed and ruminated in the way a man does after fever, I was struck by the tremendous display of one advertisement in the English press. It was a thing called Gussiter's Deep Breathing System, which, according to its promoter, was a cure for every ill, mental, moral, or physical, that man can suffer. Politicians, generals, admirals, and music-hall artists all testified to the new life it had opened up for them. I remember wondering what these sportsmen got for their testimonies, and thinking I would write a spoof letter myself to old Gussiter. Then I picked up the German papers, and suddenly my eye caught an advertisement of the same kind in the Frankfurter Zeitung. It was not Gussiter this time, but one Weissmann, and his game was identical, deep breathing. The Hun style was different from the English, all about the goddess of health, the nymphs of the mountains, and 2 quotations from Schiller, but the principle was the same. That made me ponder a little, and I went carefully through the whole batch. I found the advertisement in the Frankfurter, and in 1 or 2 rather obscure Volksstimmes und Volkszeitungs. I found it too in Der Große Krieg, the official German propagandist picture paper. They were the same all but one, and that one had a bold variation, for it contained 4 of the sentences used in the ordinary English advertisement. This struck me as fishy, and I started to write a letter to Macgillivray, pointing out what seemed to be a case of trading with the enemy, and advising him to get on to Mr. Gussiter's financial backing. I thought he might find a Hun syndicate behind him. And then I had another notion, which made me rewrite my letter. I went through the papers again. The English ones, which contained the advertisement, were all good, solid, bellicose organs, the kind of thing no censorship would object to leaving the country. I had before me a small sheaf of pacifist prints, and they had not the advertisement. That might be for reasons of circulation, or it might not. The German papers were either radical or socialist publications, just the opposite of the English lot, except the Große Krieg. Now we have a free press, and Germany has, strictly speaking, none. All her journalistic indiscretions are calculated. Therefore the Boche has no objection to his rags getting to enemy countries. He wants it. He likes to see them quoted in columns headed, "Through German Glasses," and made the text of articles showing what a good Democrat he is becoming. As I puzzled over the subject, certain conclusions began to form in my mind. The 4 identical sentences seemed to hint that deep breathing had Boche affiliations. Here was a chance of communicating with the enemy which would defy the argus-eyed gentlemen who examine the mails. What was to hinder Mr. A at one end writing an advertisement with a good cipher in it, and the paper containing it getting into Germany by Holland in 3 days? Herr B at the other end replied in the Frankfurter, and a few days later shrewd editors and acute intelligence officers, and Mr. A, were reading it in London, though only Mr. A knew what it really meant. It struck me as a bright idea, the sort of simple thing that doesn't occur to clever people, and very rarely to the Boche. I wished I was not in the middle of a battle, for I would have had a try at investigating the cipher myself. I wrote a long letter to Macgillivray putting my case, and then went to sleep. When I awoke, I reflected that it was a pretty thin argument, and would have stopped the letter if it hadn't gone off early by a ration party. After that, things began very slowly to happen. The first was when Hamilton, having gone to Boulogne to fetch some mess stores, returned with the startling news that he had seen Gresson. He had not heard his name, but described him dramatically to me as the wee red-headed devil that kicked Eccy Brocky's knee yon time you was in Glasgow, sir. I recognized the description. Gresson, it appeared, was joy-riding. He was with a party of Labour delegates who had been met by 2 officers and carried off in charabancs. Hamilton reported from inquiries among his friends that this kind of visitor came weekly. I thought it a very sensible notion on the government's part, but I wondered how Gresson had been selected. I had hoped that Macgillivray had weeks ago made a long arm and quadded him. Perhaps they had too little evidence to hang him, but he was the blackest sort of suspect and should have been interned. A week later I had occasion to be at GHQ on business connected with my new division. My friends in the intelligence allowed me to use the direct line to London, and I called up Macgillivray. For 10 minutes I had an exciting talk, for I had had no news from that quarter since I left England. I heard that the Portuguese Jew had escaped, had vanished from his native heather when they went to get him. They had identified him as a German professor of Celtic languages who had held a chair in a Welsh college, a dangerous fellow, for he was an upright, high-minded, raging fanatic. Against Gresson they had no evidence at all, but he was kept under strict observation. When I asked about his crossing to France, Macgillivray replied that that was part of their scheme. I inquired if the visit had given them any clues, but I never got an answer, for the line had to be cleared at that moment for the War Office. I hunted up the man who had charge of these Labour visits and made friends with him. Gresson, he said, had been a quiet, well-mannered and most appreciative guest. He had wept tears on Vimy Ridge and, strictly against orders, had made a speech to some troops he met on the Arras road about how British Labour was remembering the army in its prayers and sweating blood to make guns. On the last day he had had a misadventure, for he got very sick on the road, some kidney trouble that couldn't stand the jolting of the car, and had to be left at a village and picked up by the party on its way back. They found him better, but still shaky. I cross-examined the particular officer in charge about that halt, and learned that Gresson had been left alone in a peasant's cottage, for he said he only needed to lie down. The place was the hamlet of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne. For several weeks that name stuck in my head. It had a pleasant, quaint sound, and I wondered how Gresson had spent his hours there. I hunted it up on the map and promised myself to have a look at it the next time we came out to rest. And then I forgot about it till I heard the name mentioned again. On 23rd October I had the bad luck, during a tour of my first-line trenches, to stop a small shell fragment with my head. It was a close, misty day, and I had taken off my tin hat to wipe my brow when the thing happened. I got a long, shallow scalp wound, which meant nothing, but bled a lot, and as we were not in for any big move, the M.O. sent me back to a clearing station to have it seen to. I was 3 days in the place, and being perfectly well, had leisure to look about me and reflect, so that I recall that time as a queer, restful interlude in the infernal racket of war. I remember yet how on my last night there a gale made the lamps swing and flicker, and turned the grey-green canvas walls into a mass of mottled shadows. The floor canvas was muddy from the tramping of many feet, bringing in the constant dribble of casualties from the line. In my tent there was no one very bad at the time, except a boy with his shoulder half blown off by a whiz-bang who lay in a drugged sleep at the far end. The majority were influenza, bronchitis, and trench fever, waiting to be moved to the base, or convalescent and about to return to their units. A small group of us dined off tinned chicken, stewed fruit, and rat-on cheese around the smoky stove, where 2 screens manufactured from packing cases gave some protection against the draughts, which swept like young tornadoes down the tent. One man had been reading a book called The Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, and the talk turned on the unexplainable things that happen to everybody once or twice in a lifetime. I contributed a yarn about the men who went to look for Kruger's treasure in the Bushveld and got scared by a green wildebeest. It is a good yarn, and I'll write it down some day. A tall Highlander who kept his slippered feet on the top of the stove, and whose costume consisted of a kilt, a British warm, a grey hospital dressing-gown, and 4 pairs of socks, told the story of the Camerons at First Ypres, and of the lowland subaltern who knew no Gaelic and suddenly found himself encouraging his men with some ancient Highland rigmarole. The poor chap had a racking bronchial cough, which suggested that his country might well use him on some warmer battleground than Flanders. He seemed a bit of a scholar, and explained the Cameron business in a lot of long words. I remember how the talk meandered on, as talk does when men are idle and thinking about the next day. I didn't pay much attention, for I was reflecting on a change I meant to make in one of my battalion commands, when a fresh voice broke in. It belonged to a Canadian captain from Winnipeg, a very silent fellow who smoked shag tobacco. "There's a lot of ghosts in this darn country," he said. Then he started to tell about what happened to him when his division was last back in rest billets. He had a staff job and put up with the divisional command at an old French chateau. They had only a little bit of the house, the rest was shut up, but the passages were so tortuous that it was difficult to keep from wandering into the unoccupied part. One night, he said, he woke with a mighty thirst, and since he wasn't going to get cholera by drinking the local water in his bedroom, he started out for the room where they messed in to try to pick up a whiskey and soda. He couldn't find it, though he knew the road like his own name. He admitted he might have taken a wrong turning, but he didn't think so. Anyway, he landed in a passage which he had never seen before, and since he had no candle, he tried to retrace his steps. Again he went wrong, and groped on till he saw a faint light, which he thought must be the room of the GSO, a good fellow and a friend of his. So he barged in and found a big dim salon with 2 figures in it and a lamp burning between them and a queer, unpleasant smell about. He took a step forward, and then he saw that the figures had no faces. That fairly loosened his joints with fear, and he gave a cry. One of the 2 ran towards him, the lamp went out, and the sickly scent caught suddenly at his throat. After that he knew nothing till he awoke in his own bed the next morning with a splitting headache. He said he got the General's permission and went over all the unoccupied part of the house, but he couldn't find the room. Dust lay thick on everything, and there was no sign of recent human presence. I give the story as he told it in his drawling voice. "I reckon that was the genuine article in Ghosts. You don't believe me and conclude I was drunk? I wasn't. There isn't any drink concocted yet that could lay me out like that. I just struck a crack in the old universe and pushed my head outside. It may happen to you boys any day." The Highlander began to argue with him, and I lost interest in the talk. But one phrase brought me to attention. "I'll give you the name of the darn place, and the next time you're around you can do a bit of prospecting for yourself. It's called the Chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne, about 7 kilometres from Douvecourt. If I was purchasing real estate in this country, I guess I'd give that location a miss." After that I had a grim month, what with the finish of 3rd Ypres and the hustles to Cambrai. By the middle of December we had shaken down a bit, but the line my division held was not of our choosing, and we had to keep a wary eye on the Boche doings. It was a weary job, and I had no time to think of anything but the military kind of intelligence, fixing the units against us from prisoners' stories, organising small raids, and keeping the Royal Flying Corps busy. I was keen about the last, and I made several trips myself over the lines with Archie Roylance, who had got his heart's desire and by good luck belonged to the squadron just behind me. I said as little as possible about this, for GHQ did not encourage divisional generals to practice such methods, though there was one famous army commander who made a hobby of them. It was on one of these trips that an incident occurred which brought my spell of waiting on the bigger game to an end. One dull December day, just after luncheon, Archie and I set out to reconnoitre. You know the way that fogs in Picardy seem suddenly to reek out of the ground and envelop the slopes like a shawl. That was our luck this time. We had crossed the lines, flying very high, and received the usual salute of Hun Archies. After a mile or two the ground seemed to climb up to us, though we hadn't descended, and presently we were in the heart of a cold, clinging mist. We dived for several thousand feet, but the confounded thing grew thicker and no sort of landmark could be found anywhere. I thought that if we went on at this rate we should hit a tree or a church steeple and be easy fruit for the enemy. The same thought must have been in Archie's mind, for he climbed again. We got into a mortally cold zone, but the air was no clearer. Thereupon he decided to head for home and passed me word to work out a compass course on the map. That was easier said than done, but I had a rough notion of the rate we had travelled since we had crossed the lines, and I knew our original direction, so I did the best I could. On we went for a bit, and then I began to grow doubtful. So did Archie. We dropped low down, but we could hear none of the row that's always going on for a mile on each side of the lines. The world was very eerie and deadly still, so still that Archie and I could talk through the speaking tube. "We've mislaid this bloody battle," he shouted. "I think your rotten old compass has soured on us," I replied. We decided that it wouldn't do to change direction, so we held on the same course. I was getting as nervous as a kitten, chiefly owing to the silence. It's not what you expect in the middle of a battlefield. I looked at the compass carefully and saw that it was really crocked. Archie must have damaged it on a former flight and forgotten to have it changed. He had a very scared face when I pointed this out. "Great God," he croaked, for he had a fearsome cold. "We're either about Calais or near Paris or miles the wrong side of the Boche line. What the devil are we to do?" And then, to put the lid on it, his engine went wrong. It was the same performance as on the Yorkshire moors, and seemed to be a specialty of the Shark Gladys type. But this time the end came quick. We dived steeply, and I could see by Archie's grip on the stick that he was going to have his work cut out to save our necks. Save them he did, but not by much, for we jolted down at the edge of a ploughed field with a series of bumps that shook the teeth in my head. It was the same dense, dripping fog, and we crawled out of the old bus and bolted for cover like two ferreted rabbits. Our refuge was the lee of a small copse. "It's my opinion," said Archie solemnly, "that we're somewhere about La Cateau. Tim Wilbraham got left there in the retreat, and it took him 9 months to make the Dutch frontier. It's a giddy prospect, sir." I sallied out to reconnoitre. At the other side of the wood was the highway, and the fog so blanketed sound that I could not hear a man on it till I saw his face. The first one I saw made me lie flat in the covert, for he was a German soldier, field grey, forage cap, red band and all, and he had a pick on his shoulder. A second's reflection showed me that this was not final proof. He might be one of our prisoners, but it was no place to take chances. I went back to Archie, and the pair of us crossed the ploughed field and struck the road farther on. There we saw a farmer's cart with a woman and child in it. They looked French, but melancholy, just what you would expect from the inhabitants of a countryside in German occupation. Then we came to the park wall of a great house and saw dimly the outlines of a cottage. Here, sooner or later, we would get proof of our whereabouts, so we lay and shivered among the poplars of the roadside. No one seemed abroad that afternoon. For a quarter of an hour it was as quiet as the grave. Then came a sound of whistling and muffled steps. "That's an Englishman," said Archie joyfully. "No Boche could make such a beastly noise." He was right. The form of an Army Service Corps private emerged from the midst, his cap on the back of his head, his hands in his pockets, and his walk the walk of a free man. I never saw a welcomer sight than that jam merchant. We stood up and greeted him. "What's this place?" I shouted. He raised a grubby hand to his forelock. "Ocket St. Annie, sir," he said. "Beg pardon, sir, but you ain't wurt, sir." 10 minutes later I was having tea in the mess of an MT workshop, while Archie had gone to the nearest signals to telephone for a car and give instructions about his precious bus. It was almost dark, but I gulped my tea and hastened out into the thick dusk, for I wanted to have a look at the chateau. I found a big entrance with high stone pillars, but the iron gates were locked and looked as if they had not been opened in the memory of man. Knowing the way of such places, I hunted for the side entrance and found a muddy road which led to the back of the house. The front was evidently towards a kind of park. At the back was a nest of outbuildings and a section of moat which looked very deep and black in the winter twilight. This was crossed by a stone bridge with a door at the end of it. Clearly the chateau was not being used for billets. There was no sign of the British soldier. There was no sign of anything human. I crept through the fog as noiselessly as if I trod on velvet, and I hadn't even the company of my own footsteps. I remembered the Canadian's ghost story and concluded I would be imagining the same sort of thing if I lived in such a place. The door was bolted and padlocked. I turned along the side of the moat, hoping to reach the house front, which was probably modern and boasted a civilized entrance. There must be somebody in the place, for one chimney was smoking. Presently the moat petered out and gave place to a cobbled causeway, but a wall running at right angles with the house blocked my way. I had half a mind to go back and hammer at the door, but I reflected that major generals don't pay visits to deserted chateaux at night without a reasonable errand. I should look a fool in the eyes of some old concierge. The daylight was almost gone, and I didn't wish to go groping about the house with a candle. But I wanted to see what was beyond the wall, one of those whims that beset the soberest men. I rolled a dissolute water butt to the foot of it and gingerly balanced myself on its rotten staves. This gave me a grip on the flat brick top, and I pulled myself up. I looked down on a little courtyard with another wall beyond it, which shut off any view of the park. On the right was the chateau, on the left more outbuildings. The whole place was not more than 20 yards each way. I was just about to retire by the road I had come, for in spite of my fur coat it was uncommon chilly on that perch, when I heard a key turn in the door in the chateau wall beneath me. A lantern made a blur of light in the misty darkness. I saw that the bearer was a woman, an oldish woman, round-shouldered like most French peasants. In one hand she carried a leather bag, and she moved so silently that she must have worn rubber boots. The light was held level with her head and illumined her face. It was the evilest thing I have ever beheld, for a horrible scar had puckered the skin of the forehead and drawn up the eyebrows so that it looked like some diabolical Chinese mask. Slowly she padded across the yard, carrying the bag as gingerly as if it had been an infant. She stopped at the door of one of the outhouses and set down the lantern and her burden on the ground. From her apron she drew something which looked like a gas mask and put it over her head. She also put on a pair of long gauntlets. Then she unlocked the door, picked up the lantern and went in. I heard the key turn behind her. Crouching on that wall, I felt a very ugly tremor run down my spine. I had a glimpse of what the Canadian's ghost might have been. That hag, hooded like some venomous snake, was too much for my stomach. I dropped off the wall and ran, yes, ran, till I reached the high road and saw the cheery headlights of a transport wagon and heard the honest speech of the British soldier. That restored me to my senses and made me feel every kind of a fool. As I drove back to the line with Archie, I was black ashamed of my funk. I told myself that I had seen only an old countrywoman going to feed her hens. I convinced my reason, but I did not convince the whole of me. An insensate dread of the place hung around me, and I could only retrieve my self-respect by resolving to return and explore every nook of it.